Welcome to episode 68 of the Food Grats podcast, a podcast where we explore careers in the food, beverage, and agricultural industries. I'm your host, Veronica Hislop, a PhD candidate in molecular science and career partner with Food Grats. This week on the podcast, I interviewed Janice Groenheide, cheesemaker and owner of WalkaboutFarm. She owns WalkaboutFarm with her husband Rob, where they currently milk sheep with the help of the Thunder Oak Cheese Farm to produce 3 different types of cheeses, including a local feta-style cheese. More of that on the episode. On this week's episode, Janice and I talked about cheese making and what a cheesemaker does. Janice walked me through the different types of cheese that Walkabout Farms makes and all the hard work that's involved in each of the batches. We dived into what Janice enjoys about her job and some of the misconceptions that might exist about her profession. For many, the idea of becoming a cheesemaker seems like it would be a big career change, so I asked Janice how she would recommend a student tries out this line of work. Overall, I enjoyed this episode in learning about cheesemaking. I've always thought of cheesemaking as something as a craft, and I think that this episode demonstrates that that's kind of true. I've always wanted to know more about this profession, and Janice answered all my pressing questions. This episode of the podcast is powered by Careers Now. Careers Now is Food and Beverage Ontario's multi-year workforce development initiative that is connecting students and job seekers with employers in Ontario's food and beverage processing industry for exciting career opportunities. Check out careersnow.ca for more information on exciting jobs, career information, industry mentors, and training opportunities for professional development. So, enough with that introduction. Let's get on with the show. Well, thank you so much, Janice, for taking time to come on the show. We met at the Royal Agricultural Fair back in November, and I had the pleasure of listening to you when you had the presentation at the fair. And unfortunately, I guess, you were sharing the stage with 2 other people. And I was like, I need to get her on the podcast because I want the full time to just focus on Janice because she's saying some awesome stuff. So thank you for coming on the show.
Well, thank you for having me.
Well, my partner's very excited to have you on the show because I was telling him because he's like, let's start our own cheese making and brewery business. I know that's a very much harder than it sounds, obviously, but I'm still very, very wowed with what you do. So I'm going to let you take it away. So let's just start by asking, what is Walkabout Farms and can you tell me about the cheeses that you create?
For sure. So my husband and I started Walkabout Farm initially in 2011. We started just with initially sheep, and we would bring in some pigs as well for pork and marketing that. And then after a few years, we were looking at ways to make our business a little more viable. We needed just other income streams to make it a little more profitable. And we had both grown up working with dairy cattle. I had shown dairy cattle. I had done some work on my friend's dairy farm. I would help with milking a lot there. And he grew up, his parents had a dairy farm when he was young. So it was kind of a natural step for us to look at milking sheep. And it was something that we could do with the existing flock of sheep that we had. So we did a lot of research, met with a lot of different people, kind of learned a little more about what exactly that would entail. And we were very lucky that there is a cheese manufacturer in Thunder Bay here with us that Rob worked for them for a while. And they allowed us to actually use their facility for the first couple of years when we started. So we learned a lot from working with them at Thunder Oak. And then in 2019, 2020, we started building our own commercial cheese plant, which in March of 2020, we got up and running. So then we were able to branch out and do a few more cheeses. So currently with our sheep's milk, we produce a feta style cheese, a manchego style cheese, which is our take on a Spanish cheese. We have tome cheese that was a recipe that we kind of tweaked and changed to kind of make something that was ours. And it's cheese that's kind of a semi-hard cheese with a little bit of a a tang to it. And then we have in the past done Gouda, a sheep's milk Gouda as well, that we are kind of phasing out of. But right now, those are our main cheeses that we have consistently. So,
Well, I know that they're very delicious. I had the pleasure of trying it at the show, and you are right. It definitely had a tang. It was definitely. I wish I remembered what kind I had. I'm sorry, but I know it
no
was definitely
worries.
unique. It was nothing like I'd ever had before.
Yeah, it's a little different. Especially our tome is the one that we took other recipes and kind of mishmashed a few of them together, and that's what we came up with, and it turned out really good, so we kind of kept with it. So it's kind of our own unique cheese.
I was just thinking as you were talking about the different cheeses that you offered, the way you were saying it, it was so, "Oh, we did this, we naturally did some research," but I could imagine that process was not as easy as it sounded.
Oh, not at all, no. It took us a long time.
So, coming to that experience, so I know that you were looking to expand your business, but, um, did you ever really think that this would be you know let's take a step back before we start talking about that. So, it's fair to say that you are somewhat of a cheesemaker now. Maybe we could talk more about that role and like what that actually entails, and then we could start taking it back and peeling the layers. But could you tell me more about like what it is you do making these cheeses?
Sure. So predominantly my husband does most of the actual farm work. He does a lot of the work with the animals and I kind of fill in where needed. So it's kind of a at minimum, a full day process that involves we start out with pasteurizing. All of our cheeses are pasteurized. And then once we get through that, each recipe is slightly different. So we add different bacterial cultures as well as rennet, depending on kind of what we're trying to achieve. And then there's a cutting and cooking process typically. So for instance, our feta, all of cheese curd is then cut into cubes and it just drains overnight to get as much of the whey out as we can. Some of our other cheeses like the tome and manchego are then cut into little cubes and then we go through what's called a cooking process. So we heat the whey and curd up to a certain temperature and then heat it until it gets to the consistency we're looking for. And then they're pressed under a set amount of weight. And a lot of it is done, I monitor the pH of the cheese and the whey. And once we hit my targets, then often it goes into the brine and stays in the brine again for a set amount of time. And then all of our cheeses are aged in our cheese room, which is a temperature and humidity controlled. And all of our cheeses, we do a natural rind. We don't wax the cheeses or anything. They're flipped every couple of days. And then the manchego in particular is rubbed with olive oil after a couple of weeks. And then we age them until minimum of usually 3 months. And then onwards until usually we run out of the stock. So
Wow, that sounds so sciencey. I love it.
it is a really fun science experiment. Yeah.
Wow. So it sounds as though well, I guess what I wanted to take a step back and just talk more about is that you have always been, it sounds, doing a little bit of reading, is that you have been exposed to agriculture and the entire field of this. Why did you decide to stay within that agricultural realm? Did you always plan to stay in the agricultural side, or was this something that you maybe thought about doing something different?
So, funny enough, I did attend the University of Guelph for agriculture, but I actually left. So I became a paramedic as well. So I actually do both. So I did actually leave agriculture for a while, but my husband is also, he studied agriculture. He's always been involved with it. So I've always kind of had kind of one foot still in the game. Yeah, I've always, even when I wasn't really active in it, have always kind of been involved in the kind of the peripheries. So it certainly has been something that was always going to be a part of my life. I didn't know how much of it was going to be a part of my life. And admittedly, cheese making was not originally on my radar. But yeah, it's taken a few twists and turns. But yeah, it was something that certainly I was always going to have some involvement in.
So it really doesn't sound like, correct me if I'm wrong, that like your career path, you were like, I'm going to go do that. I'm set on that. It was more of a, next taking the next step, taking the next step and just kind of going with what felt right at the time.
Absolutely. Yeah. I have completely overhauled what I was going to do with my life multiple times. So,
You know, I
yeah.
I think that's nice to hear because I feel more and more, growing up, you have this pressure of like, what are you going to do when you grow up? And then, you go to college and you go to university and you're signing up for the next 4 years of your life. And it can be a really difficult choice, especially when you're paying tuition money to make a change when maybe you know that it wasn't right for you.
Yeah.
And it's nice to hear that you can still wind up in a good place even without necessarily knowing that that was the thing you were gonna do, like, 10 years ago.
Oh, absolutely. When I went into university, I really, I mean, I wanted to be a vet, as many people do. And yeah, I'd never, it just didn't work out. And taking a step back and changing my path was one of the best decisions I ever made. And I love both of my careers now. So I love being a paramedic. I still do that full time as well. But I love my business. I love making cheese and working with my husband to kind of create that has been super rewarding. So yeah, my
How
path has never been straight. So
how do you manage to do it all and have kids?
that's a good question. A lot of support, a lot of support. My husband does a lot of work around the house when I'm gone working. So yeah, a lot of teamwork, but yeah, it can be a lot. I
Let
will
me
admit that.
imagine. It really is commendable. Just I can't even, people managing just one job and having kids, and being involved in their life too, and obviously wanting to have, be as much as you can be there. But that's, it's really wonderful. You're able to do all this, especially with someone that you have a good support with.
Mhm, yeah, for sure.
Moving on as well, like so talking about let's focus obviously on the cheese making, not the paramedic.
Yes.
What is it that you like why so you naturally started to come into figuring about the cheeses and all that. And I wanted to know like why do you continue to do this? Like what part of your job do you like best about it?
Well, that's a good question. So I mean, I enjoy the process of the cheese making. It's always kind of been like a fun science experiment for me that I get to eat at the end, which is the best part. I love changing things and seeing what'll happen. I love doing like I will periodically take small batches of milk and make different cheeses that I just want to try. Like I did a cheddar recently that I'm anxiously waiting until it's ready. So that's one of my favorite things. And the sense of accomplishment to see where we started and where we've managed to get to is really cool to see kind of what we started with and how far we've really come is kind of one of the coolest things for me, I think, is just kind of realizing that somehow we have made this a reality. So that's pretty cool.
That's so amazing. And I can imagine when you went to the fair and just seeing, you know, you sell cheese in the stores and that, but actually seeing people try the samples in front of you that like they enjoyed it.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a really cool feeling, and having people recognize the cheeses, like, having someone recognize manchego and then say, "Oh, this is a really good manchego," or having people try the feta and tell me, "Oh, I would get feta like this in Greece, and it tastes really good," and that sort of things. It feels really good. It's a great accomplishment to see people try everything and like it.
And when doing your little experiments, like where do you get the inspiration? Because, it's easy to say I'm going to make something like a feta or I'm going to make that, but getting into the technicalities of it, that can be a lot more challenging. So where do you get your inspiration and even just like the technical know-how to know I need to add 500 grams of this and 600 of grams of that, for example?
So I have a lot of books with different recipes, but I actually took a cheese making course at the University of Guelph. And so in that, I learned a lot of the recipes and different things. And then reading through the books, you kind of learn like what certain pH levels or what certain bacteria or things like that effects they can have. So sometimes I'm combining the process for two kind of similar cheeses, but they end up with there's different endings. So it's kind of I'm trying to tweak one certain thing and sometimes it works really well. Other times it doesn't at all. It's kind of I've had many, many failures, but I guess that's kind of part of the fun of it, really.
I love that you use the word fun. I think that's a really key word because I think it's easy to get caught up in it being a so-called failure, and not just allowing yourself to go, oh, this didn't work out. Like, do you ever get those senses of feeling like, oh, this was a failure rather than then this is just a stepping stone to making a better quality cheese?
Oh, absolutely. I have moments of oh, this was a failure. Um, I think I think that's kind of normal. Everyone goes through those. I've certainly had moments where I've just, you feel kind of defeated and frustrated um, but I think, at least for me, having again, a husband who's kind of in this with me and we're kind of working together. We have a bit of a rule that only one of us is allowed to have a freak out at any time.
Okay.
So
I
if
like
something's
that.
going wrong, yeah, only one of us is allowed to freak out. The other one has to be rational and figure it out. And then the next time, the other person gets to freak out.
I feel like there's a story behind this.
Oh, wow. There's a few stories behind that.
That's so funny. Okay, I'm gonna have to steal that one. I like that. So yeah, so clearly, you're not both freaking out at the same time. But so, thinking about this from the perspective of students and that I know for you, you had a somewhat of a peripheral in the agricultural side of the industry, but like for a lot of students, a lot of people grow up in maybe the suburbs or they maybe don't grow up somewhere that's more accessible to try something like, cheese making. Though would you have any advice for like how a student you would maybe recommend trying out this line of work? Like, do you think that there's like job opportunities or volunteering? Like, is there anything that you might be aware of that might help them see if cheese making is for them?
So, one option, and the kind of cool thing about cheese making is, I mean, you can do it at home. All you really need, there's lots of websites where you can order small things of rennet or you can order cheese making kits to make certain types of cheeses. I mean, some cheeses you just need an acid like lemon juice or something like that. There's lots of recipes online. So if it is something you think you would maybe be interested in, you can try it at home with a little thermometer and a pot and just see how it goes. Failing that, you can always there's lots of stores. I mean, depending on where you live, you can go to a specialty cheese store and talk to them and kind of get some information. It is a little harder just because of regulations to be able to go into a plant and be involved in the actual cheese making, but it's certainly worth interviewing people in that profession. And like I said, the University of Guelph has a wonderful course, and the professor that runs that course is wonderful. He's a great source of knowledge. So any of those kind of avenues are great ways to kind of get some more information and maybe get your feet wet a little bit. It's amazing what you can find online now. There's lots of videos on YouTube of people making cheeses and how to do it at home. You can set up your own little aging room in your house. There's lots of ways to kind of try it out and see if it's even something you like doing. And that's
Oh,
kind of probably where I would start.
those are really good pieces of advice. I guess I have to get my partner to make some cheese on the stove sometime soon.
Yeah, there's lots of ones. Some of the softer fresh cheeses are actually not terribly difficult once you have a recipe and kind of an idea what you're doing. Yeah, like even something like if you have a double boiler, because that's the hardest part is not burning the milk on the bottom if you only have one pot. So
Actually, I want to talk a little bit more about University of Guelph cheesemaking course because I've seen it, whenever you type up like food science course or like food science, like that's one of the first ones that appears. So would you be able to tell me a little bit more about what that entailed and like how yeah, just more details about that.
yeah, for sure. So when I went, now I think it has changed. I think they've changed a little bit of it, but I went, it was part of a grant I had received and it was my educational component. And it was, I think it was there for a few days, like a couple days, and they did kind of some background information about the components of milk, the process of cheese making, really what makes the cheese, what happens during pasteurization, what happens if you pasteurize at too high of a temperature or too long, and so on and so forth. And then after we did a lot of the classroom things, and we did some food safety components with regards to sanitization, that sort of thing within the cheese plant. Then we spent a couple days in the University of Guelph's cheese making facility, actually making different types of cheese. And the University of Guelph, if you go on their website, actually has the textbook that you received during this course as an ebook online. So you can get all of the recipes and information that is in that book online as well.
That
Uh,
is, wow, that's really cool.
yeah, so that's one of the bigger sources of information that I use is that recipe book, and that's how I kind of take certain kind of overall types of cheese and then kind of change little things to kind of see what it'll do. Yeah, so that's one of my main sources.
I'm guessing you have a very detailed notebook that you kind of keep track of everything, what's going right and what's going wrong.
I do, yeah, I do. I write down. So we have forms that I found some online and kind of again just kind of change things that so it would work better for me. But I take measurements at certain steps within the process and I write down what temperature I aim to do something at and then what the actual temperature was when it happened. Because sometimes you'll be raising the temperature and you kind of overshoot by a degree or two. So if something great happens, I want to be able to say, oh, okay, this is what was different.
So even just something like 1 degree difference can actually make it a 1 degree difference
Yeah.
actually does make a difference?
Yeah, it definitely can. I find fluctuations in pH is a big one because I can tell just by what my pH is doing whether or not. And this has actually happened where I had a batch of culture that I was using that actually didn't work. So my milk didn't do what it was supposed to do. So by monitoring that, I can kind of anticipate when things are not going right
Oh
instead of
my.
finding out when I go to eat my cheese later on.
I guess it's
So,
better to know now than later. I know because I work in a science lab and I'm like, I'm very grateful that I'm not one of the people working with a pH meter because I know how
yeah.
much frustrations they get.
Oh, yeah, it can be super frustrating. Or you'll think you have the right pH, and then all of a sudden you look down and you're like, "Oh, it's changed again. Why is it
Oh,
shifted?" 'Cause it
oh,
yeah.
that is
So,
annoying.
yeah.
In dealing with those, one of the things I was also wondering is just I like to know with when I ask like interview people, like, are there any misconceptions that there are about the industry that maybe you work in? I know a lot of people can think one way and it might be totally different. Like when it comes to the cheese making, is there any misconceptions that, you think people have and they're just not necessarily true?
That's a really good question. I don't know necessarily if it's a misconception, but I don't think people always realize the amount of time that goes into making a really good cheese. It's definitely not something you start in the morning, you make it up, and then that product's ready to sell right away. It can take, months to years to get to the finished product. So, and there's so many factors that can change the outcome, from the temperature of the room to the amount of pressure that you have during pressing it or leaving it in too long in the brine, temperature in the aging room. There's so many factors that go into making that final product, that it's actually way more complicated than you would think.
Really good point. I'm sorry, I'm just, like, thinking too about just what we take for granted when we go, I buy some cheese from the store, I buy the same brand of cheese just because that's my go-to, and it's pretty consistently the same, and that's actually quite amazing when it's such a, like you mentioned, a very high food.
Yeah, and it's too, I think, and one of the things I've kind of realized as I make more and more cheese, that you get a lot of cheeses where, like with machines, where a lot of it's automated, a lot of it's much easier to consistently replicate. But one of the coolest things that I find, at least with our stuff, that sometimes not everything, you can't control everything. So sometimes, and don't get me wrong, the odd time things will go, they'll go bad. But sometimes that's when you find the best recipes, is you've messed something up, but in a good way. And the cheesemaker that we actually used to work with, he said it one time where he said, you are always making cheese. You just make a different kind of cheese when you screw up. See, you do. And sometimes you don't ever want to repeat that different cheese. But then sometimes you really do, because it turns out to be something really cool. So that, I think, is something that people don't necessarily think about. Yeah, is how many different factors there are to getting that one piece of cheese.
That's that's such I love that saying because I think it can be applied to other aspects of our life too that, you know, I fall victim to this where it's like it needs to be this exact way, but if you put yourself I mean, of course, if it tastes bad at the end of the day for a cheese, then it's a bad tasting cheese. But, you put yourself in this box and don't let yourself like take a step back and say, "Oh, in hindsight, maybe that's actually a better way to go." Doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing now.
Yeah, exactly.
So again, it sounds like you've had some support through this journey as well. How is there a big cheesemaker community that you're a part of, or is it very, on your own?
So we're just starting to kind of get into things. It didn't work out this year, but some of the like stores that specialty cheese stores and stuff, were starting to meet more people and kind of get out of the, what I'll call, the Thunder Bay bubble. So we're just kind of getting into that. There is some dairy sheep organizations and stuff like that we're a part of, and we've met people, and we've done a few conferences and stuff. So we're just kind of, especially because we started during COVID, we're just starting to get those kind of opportunities. But we've been very lucky here to have another cheese processor that is really incredible and really willing to help us out. And really, I mean, we couldn't have gotten started the way we did without them. So we've been very lucky that way.
That's amazing. Well, I hopefully one time can take a trek over to Thunder Bay. It's not exactly a hop, skip, and jump from me, but I'd love to
Oh,
one time explore the region and just, see what you're doing at the farm.
yeah, for sure.
We're coming close to the end of our episode, and there were just a few more things that I wanted to ask you before I let you go. And we might have maybe already touched upon this, but I always like to ask, are there any particular skills or topics that you're currently learning about that maybe you'd like to share?
So right now, one of the things we're kind of working on learning, because I mean, there's always something, is ice cream making.
Ooh.
Uh, yeah, so we've done a couple of experimental batches and that sort of thing. So that's kind of one area that we're looking at. We're always kind of looking at ways to improve what we're doing. So whether it kind of the process that we do, if there's ways that it can be done better or more efficiently, or even coming down to like marketing and that sort of thing, because that is something that neither of us have really have a lot of experience with. So that's been a learning curve. But but yeah, that's kind of where we're focusing on right now, is kind of expanding what we do and tweaking things that we already do so that maybe it's a little bit better. So,
Well, I wish you all the best of luck with that. It's always too bad when, you have so much fun doing the cheese making and all that. And then from what I've learned, it's half the battle because next you have to actually get it into people's mouths because you know that it's
yeah,
really good and tasty, but it's just there's so much competition out there.
exactly. And our location too is a bit of a challenge to overcome just because we are a little secluded. So,
I Yeah, I did a little bit of a map just to double because I didn't recognize the township and I was like, "Oh, it's over there."
yeah, it is fairly north and west. So, yeah, the things like online ordering and shipping is something we're working on, and I will be putting some stuff on our website to start shipping and ordering online, but it is something that's a bit harder because, I mean, no one wants to buy 1 block of cheese and have to pay $25 in shipping. So,
Yeah, that's the unfortunate part. Hopefully that does come soon and when it does, you're gonna have to make sure to let me know and then we can share it in the show notes for other people to try, get the word out there. But before I do let you go, I wanna ask you okay, so we'll ask you 2 more questions. So the first one is the second one's a quick one, but the first one is I always like to ask, what advice would you give students looking to enter in a role that's similar to yours, or maybe even just life advice in general?
the best advice that I could give would be to be open to whatever ideas and opportunities kind of come your way. You never really know what is going to pop up, and something that you may have never thought about in your life may end up being a really, really good opportunity for you. So just be open to new ideas and experiences and not to be afraid of failure, because you don't learn anything unless you experience how not to do things. So, yeah, just be open to all sorts of new experiences and yeah, never give up trying. So,
Well, I'll leave it at that and end off the interview with my last question. Where can people find you and Walkabout Farm?
so right now we're in several places in Thunder Bay. So our biggest seller is our country market up here, as well as there's an online ordering system for deliveries locally. And hopefully, right now I actually do have a couple of our manchego and our feta cheese available on our website for shipping. That being said, our website is w.walkaboutfarm.ca, and I'm available via email, and will happily work with anyone who wants to maybe order some cheese or is interested in trying to figure out a way to get our product from further away. We also had a store that, oh darn, there's a store in Mississauga. Lakeview Cheese Galore also has ordered some of our manchego as well, so they have been carrying it in stock. So I think they still have some at this point, so that's another store that we are in as well.
That is amazing. Well, I'll make sure to link any of those in the show notes. And I highly suggest when people have the opportunity to check out your cheeses because they are very tasty and very unique. And I know that I for sure enjoyed it. So thank you so much, Janice, for taking time to come on the show. I think what you're doing is really cool. And I just love just the craftsmanship that goes into cheese making. I know you talked about the differences and like all these different factors that go into making cheeses and how it really takes on the craft of whoever's making it. So thank you for sharing that with us.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
That was episode 66 of the Food Grads podcast. All the notes to this podcast can be found by clicking on the Student and Grads tab on the Food Grads website. There you can find any notes to past or future episodes on our newly designed podcast page. Once again, thank you to our partner Careers Now for their continued support of this podcast, so we can continue to deliver great conversations like the one you just heard. If you enjoyed this episode, then please head over to wherever you listen to this podcast episode and rate it 5 stars. This helps us get the word out there about this podcast and share how great the industry is. Thank you everyone so much for listening. I know that you could be listening to anything else right now, but you chose us. So, again, thank you. It was fun talking with Janice and learning about what she does. I've always found cheesemaking to be one of those honest careers. A craft where you're able to work with your hands and the labor of your hard work becomes something delicious. Something akin to a brewmaker, a flavorist, or a chef. It really does take a combination of hard work, an eye for detail, an understanding of science, and just a good sense of flavor. Listening back to this episode while editing, I really got the sense of that's what Janice is like. I'm fortunate enough to actually tried her cheese, and it was unlike any other cheese that I've ever tried before. It felt unique, and it's just like you could taste the hard work that went into it. I think it's so wonderful how Janice has found a profession that she loves while still being close to her family. Well, that's it for this week's episode. Thank you everyone so much for listening, and I will see you next time.